The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Clarence's house as King Charles made his way through the private quarters that had once belonged to his late mother, Queen Elizabeth. It had been months since her passing, and the task of sorting through decades of royal possessions remained an overwhelming burden that fell heavily upon his shoulders. Charles moved slowly through the room, his fingers trailing along the edges of furniture that held countless memories. Each piece told a story of the monarchy's long history, but today he was focused on a particular mission, locating items that had belonged to Diana, Princess of Wales, that needed to be returned to their sons, William and Harry. The relationship between Charles and Diana had been tumultuous, filled with pain, misunderstandings, and ultimately, a very public divorce that had shaken the very foundations of the British royal family. Even now, more than 25 years after her tragic death in Paris, the wounds remained tender, and Charles approached anything connected to his former wife with a mixture of reverence and reluctance. In a corner of the room sat an ornate mahogany cabinet that Charles recognized immediately. It had been Diana's jewelry cabinet, one of the few personal items that had made its way back to the royal collection after her death. The cabinet itself was a work of art, with intricate carvings along its edges and small brass fixtures that caught the light as Charles approached it. He had avoided opening this particular piece of furniture for years, knowing that inside lay not just jewelry but memories that he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. However, with William's upcoming birthday approaching, Charles knew it was time to ensure that Diana's precious items found their way to her sons, who deserved to have these tangible connections to their beloved mother. With trembling hands, Charles inserted the small brass key that had been carefully preserved in the royal collection. The lock clicked softly, and he slowly opened the cabinet doors, revealing multiple small drawers and compartments that Diana had used to organize her extensive jewelry collection. The first drawer contained some of Diana's most recognizable pieces: the sapphire earrings that had perfectly complemented her engagement ring, several delicate gold bracelets that she had worn to countless royal functions, and a string of pearls that had been a wedding gift from the Queen. Charles handled each piece carefully, remembering how beautiful Diana had looked wearing them during happier times in their marriage. As he worked through the drawers systematically, Charles found himself transported back to those early days when Diana had been so young and excited about joining the royal family. She had taken such joy in selecting jewelry for various occasions, often asking his opinion about which pieces worked best with particular outfits. Those had been simpler times, before the pressures of royal life and their fundamental incompatibilities had begun to drive them apart. The third drawer contained some of Diana's more personal pieces, jewelry that she had inherited from her own family, including a beautiful emerald brooch that had belonged to her grandmother. Charles smiled slightly as he remembered Diana telling him the story behind that particular piece, how her grandmother had worn it to her own wedding, and how Diana had hoped to pass it down to any daughters she might have. It was while he was carefully examining a delicate silver locket in the fourth drawer that Charles noticed something unusual. The drawer seemed slightly shorter than the others, and when he pressed gently on the back panel, it gave way slightly under pressure. Curious, he applied a bit more force, and to his surprise, the back panel slid away, revealing a hidden compartment that he had never known existed. Inside the secret space, Charles found a small collection of items that Diana had clearly wanted to keep completely private. There were a few photographs that he didn't recognize, some pressed flowers that looked as though they might have been from bouquets she had received, and most intriguingly, a sealed envelope with, "To be opened only in case of my death," written in Diana's distinctive handwriting across the front. Charles stared at the envelope for a long moment, his heart racing as he considered the implications of what he had found. Diana had clearly anticipated that there might come a time when someone would need to know whatever information was contained within that envelope. The fact that she had hidden it so carefully suggested that the contents were of significant importance. His hands shook slightly as he picked up the envelope, noting that it was still sealed with wax that bore Diana's personal seal. She had taken great care to ensure that whatever was inside would remain private until the right moment arrived. Charles wondered if this moment, so many years after her death, could possibly be what Diana had intended when she wrote those words on the envelope. The weight of the envelope felt substantial in his hands, suggesting that it contained more than just a simple note. Charles found himself wondering what Diana had felt compelled to preserve in such a secretive manner. and whether the contents would shed new light on events that had shaped both their lives and the future of the monarchy. As he stood there in the quiet room, surrounded by the remnants of Diana's life, Charles felt the full weight of history pressing down upon him. Whatever was contained in that envelope had been important enough for Diana to take extraordinary measures to preserve it, and he knew that opening it might change his understanding of their relationship and the events that had followed their separation. The afternoon light continued to stream through the windows, casting long shadows across the room as Charles contemplated his next move. In his hands, he held what might be Diana's final message to the world, and he knew that once he broke that seal, there would be no going back to the way things had been just moments before. With a deep breath, Charles carefully broke the wax seal and opened the envelope, his eyes immediately drawn to the opening lines of what appeared to be a lengthy letter written in Diana's careful script. The first words he read made his blood run cold and filled him with a rage that he had not felt in decades. The letter began, "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and it means that my fears about my safety were justified. There are things about my death that the world needs to know, and people who should be held accountable for what they have done to me and to our children." Charles felt his hands begin to tremble as he continued reading, each line of Diana's letter revealing information that he had never known, and painting a picture of events that was far different from what he had been led to believe. The implications of what he was reading were staggering, and he realized that Diana had uncovered information that could fundamentally change how the world viewed the royal family and the circumstances surrounding her death. As he read on, Charles felt a mixture of emotions washing over him: grief for Diana, anger at those who had deceived him, and fear about what these revelations might mean for the monarchy that he had recently inherited. Diana's words painted a picture of manipulation, betrayal, and conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the establishment that Charles now led. The letter continued for several pages, each containing details that made Charles question everything he thought he knew about the final years of Diana's life. She had clearly been far more aware of the forces working against her than anyone had realized, and she had taken steps to document and preserve evidence of what she had discovered. By the time Charles finished reading the letter, the afternoon sun had begun to set, casting the room in a golden glow that seemed somehow ominous given the darkness of what he had just learned. In his hands, he held information that could destroy careers, topple governments, and forever change how the public viewed the institution that he had sworn to protect and preserve. The rage that filled Charles was unlike anything he had experienced before. It was not just anger at those who had betrayed Diana, but fury at himself for not seeing the signs, for not protecting her when she had needed him most, and for allowing himself to be manipulated by forces that had ultimately led to her destruction. As he carefully folded the letter and considered his next steps, Charles realized that Diana had given him a final gift, not just the truth about what had happened to her, but also the power to ensure that justice would finally be served. The question now was whether he had the courage to use the information she had provided, knowing that doing so might well bring down the very institution he had spent his entire life preparing to lead. Charles spent the entire night poring over Diana's letter, reading and rereading each devastating revelation, until the words were burned into his memory. As dawn broke over London, he sat in his study, surrounded by documents and photographs that Diana had carefully preserved alongside her written testimony. The scope of what she had uncovered was far more extensive than he had initially realized. The letter detailed a complex web of surveillance, manipulation, and interference that had surrounded Diana during the final years of her life. She wrote about discovering listening devices in her private apartments at Kensington Palace, about having her phone calls monitored, and about being followed by individuals who were clearly not standard security personnel. Most shocking of all, she had documented evidence that senior members of the royal household had been working with intelligence services to undermine her public work and personal relationships. Diana's handwriting became more urgent as the letter progressed, revealing her growing awareness that her life was in danger. She had discovered that her charitable work, particularly her campaign against landmines, had made powerful enemies who viewed her activism as a threat to British commercial interests. Arms dealers and their political allies had apparently begun viewing Diana not as a beloved princess, but as an obstacle to be removed. The letter contained specific names, dates, and locations that painted a chilling picture of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. Diana had meticulously documented meetings that she had accidentally overheard, conversations that had been reported to her by loyal staff members, and suspicious incidents that she had initially dismissed but later came to view as part of a coordinated campaign against her. Charles was particularly shaken by Diana's account of a meeting she had witnessed between his own private secretary and representatives from an intelligence agency. According to Diana's letter, his most trusted advisor had been providing regular updates on Charles's schedule, his mood, and his level of knowledge about Diana's activities. The betrayal cut deep, as Charles realized that he had been as much a victim of this conspiracy as Diana herself. The photographs that accompanied the letter were equally disturbing. Diana had somehow obtained images of individuals who had been surveilling her, license plates of vehicles that had followed her, and even copies of official documents that detailed plans for managing the Diana problem. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, painting a picture of an establishment that had viewed Diana as an existential threat to their power and influence. One photograph in particular caught Charles's attention, an image of Diana meeting with Mohammed Al-Fayed in what appeared to be a clandestine setting. According to her letter, Al-Fayed had approached her with information about the conspiracy against her, and had offered to help her escape to safety. Diana wrote that she had initially been skeptical of Al-Fayed's claims, but had gradually come to trust him as more evidence emerged of the plot against her. The letter revealed that Diana had been planning to leave Britain permanently, taking William and Harry with her to begin a new life away from the royal family. She had been secretly making arrangements for this exodus, using Al-Fayed's resources and connections to establish a safe haven where she and her sons could live without fear of interference or surveillance. The tragic irony was that Diana had died while in the process of implementing her escape plan. Charles felt his anger growing as he read Diana's account of how their children had been used as pawns in this deadly game. She wrote about William and Harry being questioned by individuals posing as family friends, about their activities being monitored, and about subtle threats being made regarding their safety if Diana continued with her more controversial public activities. The idea that his sons had been subjected to such treatment filled Charles with a protective rage that he had never experienced before. The letter also contained Diana's suspicions about the circumstances that would ultimately lead to her death. She had received specific warnings about traveling to Paris, about the dangers of being in vehicles that could be tampered with, and about the risks of being photographed in situations that could be misinterpreted by the public. Most chillingly, she had written about a conversation in which someone had suggested that accidents could be arranged if other methods of silencing her proved ineffective. Diana's final pages focused on her hopes that the truth would eventually emerge, and that those responsible for the conspiracy against her would be brought to justice. She had hidden additional evidence in various locations, creating a trail of breadcrumbs that could be followed by anyone brave enough to pursue the truth. She had also arranged for certain information to be released automatically if anything happened to her, though Charles realized that these safeguards had apparently failed in the chaos following her death. As Charles absorbed the full scope of Diana's revelations, he began to understand why she had become so paranoid and isolated in her final years. The woman who had once been so open and trusting had been forced to live in a state of constant fear, never knowing who she could trust or where the next threat might come from. The vibrant, compassionate princess that the public had loved had been systematically destroyed by forces that viewed her humanitarian work as a threat to their interests. The letter also shed new light on some of Diana's more controversial relationships and decisions during her final years. Charles now understood that her friendship with Dodi Al-Fayed had been as much about finding protection as it had been about romance. The Al-Fayed family had offered Diana something that the royal family had failed to provide: genuine security and the promise of a life free from the surveillance and manipulation that had consumed her existence. Charles was forced to confront his own role in Diana's suffering. As he read her account of their final conversations, Diana had tried to warn him about what was happening, but he had dismissed her concerns as paranoia brought on by the stress of their divorce and her adjustment to life outside the royal family. He realized now that his failure to take her seriously had contributed to her isolation and had prevented him from protecting her when she had needed him most. The implications of Diana's revelations extended far beyond their personal relationship. If her allegations were true, then the very foundations of the constitutional monarchy were built on a web of lies and deception. The intelligence services, the royal household, and potentially even members of the government had conspired to silence a member of the royal family who had become inconvenient to their interests. Charles understood that he now faced an impossible choice. He could suppress Diana's letter and continue to protect the institution that he had inherited, or he could honor her memory by exposing the truth about what had been done to her. Either choice would have devastating consequences. Suppression would mean living with the knowledge that justice had been denied, while exposure could destroy the monarchy and everything that previous generations had worked to build. As the morning progressed, Charles began to notice increased activity around Clarence House. Additional security personnel had appeared, and there seemed to be more traffic than usual on the normally quiet street outside his windows. He wondered if his discovery of Diana's letter had somehow been detected, and whether the same forces that had once worked against Diana were now mobilizing to contain this new threat to their secrets. The realization that he might now be in danger himself added a new dimension to Charles's anger. The idea that the same people who had destroyed Diana might now view him as a threat was both terrifying and infuriating. He was no longer just a grieving ex-husband seeking answers about his former wife's death. He was now a king in possession of information that could bring down his own government and destroy the institution he had sworn to protect. Charles carefully secured Diana's letter and the accompanying evidence in his personal safe, knowing that these documents represented both his greatest weapon and his greatest vulnerability. The knowledge they contained could either vindicate Diana's memory or destroy everything that Charles held dear, and he knew that his next decisions would determine which outcome prevailed. The weight of Diana's final message settled heavily on Charles's shoulders as he contemplated the enormity of what she had entrusted to him. She had given him the power to seek justice for her death, but using that power would require him to risk everything he had spent his life working toward. The question that haunted him was whether he had the courage to honor Diana's sacrifice by exposing the truth, regardless of the personal cost. Charles knew he could not pursue Diana's allegations alone. The forces that had conspired against her were still active, still powerful, and still dangerous. He needed allies who could be trusted completely. Individuals whose loyalty to truth outweighed their allegiance to the establishment that had sheltered them for decades. His first call was to Sir David Manning, a retired diplomat who had served with distinction in various capacities and whose integrity was beyond question. Manning had known Diana personally and had always harbored private doubts about the official explanations surrounding her death. When Charles reached out to arrange a private meeting, Manning immediately sensed the gravity of the situation. They met at a discreet location outside London, a country estate belonging to one of Charles's oldest friends who could be trusted to provide privacy without asking uncomfortable questions. As Charles shared Diana's letter with Manning, he watched the older man's face grow increasingly grave. Manning had seen enough in his diplomatic career to recognize the hallmarks of a sophisticated intelligence operation, and Diana's documentation bore all the characteristics of such an endeavor. Manning agreed to help investigate the allegations, but insisted they would need additional expertise to properly verify the evidence Diana had collected. He suggested bringing in Dr. Sarah Collins, a former intelligence analyst who had left government service after becoming disillusioned with the ethical compromises required in her field. Collins had since become a respected academic, specializing in the study of covert operations and their impact on democratic institutions. The three of them formed an unlikely team. A king seeking justice for his former wife, a retired diplomat driven by conscience, and a former spy haunted by the secrets she had helped to keep. Working in absolute secrecy, they began the painstaking process of verifying Diana's claims and following the leads she had provided in her letter. Their first breakthrough came when Collins used her contacts to verify some of the surveillance equipment that Diana had described finding in her apartments. The serial numbers that Diana had carefully recorded matched devices that had been issued to a specific intelligence unit during the mid-1990s. More disturbing still, the deployment records for those devices had been classified at the highest levels, suggesting that the surveillance of Diana had been authorized by senior officials. Manning's diplomatic connections proved equally valuable as they worked to verify Diana's claims about the meetings she had witnessed. Several retired embassy staff members confirmed unusual activities during the period Diana had described, including the presence of individuals who did not appear on any official visitor logs, but who had clearly been given access to secure areas of various government buildings. As their investigation progressed, Charles began to understand the full scope of what Diana had uncovered. The conspiracy against her had not been a simple matter of personal animosity or political disagreement. Instead, it appeared to have been a calculated effort to neutralize someone whose humanitarian work and global influence had begun to interfere with established commercial and political interests. Diana's campaign against landmines, in particular, had threatened to disrupt lucrative arms deals and defense contracts worth billions of pounds. Her influence with world leaders and her ability to focus international attention on humanitarian issues had made her a formidable opponent to those who profited from conflict and instability. The conspiracy against her had been born not from personal malice, but from cold financial calculation. The evidence also revealed the sophisticated nature of the psychological warfare that had been waged against Diana. Her increasing isolation, her struggles with depression, and her erratic behavior in her final years had not been simply the result of personal difficulties. They had been the intended consequences of a deliberate campaign designed to undermine her credibility and effectiveness. Charles was particularly disturbed to learn about the extent to which his own household had been compromised. Diana's letter contained detailed accounts of conversations that could only have been obtained through extensive surveillance of Charles himself, his private discussions about Diana, his concerns about her welfare, and even his intimate thoughts about their relationship had apparently been monitored and reported to those orchestrating the conspiracy. The investigation also uncovered evidence of financial irregularities that supported Diana's claims. Shell companies linked to arms dealers had made substantial donations to various royal charities during the period when Diana's anti-landmine campaign was gaining international momentum. These donations appeared to have been designed to create conflicts of interest that would either silence Diana or discredit her if she continued her humanitarian work. Collins's analysis of the documentary evidence revealed a pattern of behavior that was consistent with sophisticated intelligence operations. The conspiracy against Diana had incorporated elements of surveillance, psychological manipulation, disinformation, and ultimately, physical elimination. The professionals involved had been skilled, well-funded, and operating with apparent official authorization. One of the most chilling discoveries came when they traced the movements of several individuals who had been photographed near Diana during her final days in Paris. Using facial recognition technology and intelligence databases that Collins still had access to, they identified several operatives with known connections to covert operations. The presence of these individuals in Paris at the time of Diana's death was far too coincidental to be explained by chance. The investigation also revealed that Diana had not been the only target of this type of operation. Collins found evidence suggesting that other public figures who had challenged established interests in similar ways had been subjected to comparable campaigns of harassment and intimidation. Diana's case appeared to be part of a broader pattern of suppressing dissent among high-profile individuals whose influence could affect public policy. As their evidence mounted, Charles began to understand why Diana had become so desperate to escape Britain with their children. She had not been paranoid. She had been entirely rational in her assessment of the threat she faced. Her attempts to warn others, including Charles himself, had been dismissed because the conspiracy against her had been so sophisticated that even those closest to her had been unable to recognize it for what it was. The personal cost of the investigation began to weigh heavily on all three members of the team. Charles found himself questioning every relationship he had maintained during Diana's lifetime, wondering who among his advisors and friends had been complicit in the conspiracy against her. The knowledge that he had been deceived by people he trusted completely filled him with a sense of betrayal that went beyond his anger about Diana's treatment. Manning struggled with the implications of what they were discovering for the institutions he had served faithfully throughout his career. The idea that the government and intelligence services he had worked for had been capable of orchestrating such an elaborate deception challenged his fundamental beliefs about the nature of British democracy and the rule of law. Collins found herself reliving the moral compromises she had made during her own intelligence career, wondering whether she had unknowingly participated in similar operations against other targets. The investigation forced her to confront the possibility that her former colleagues had been capable of far worse actions than she had ever imagined. Despite these personal struggles, the team pressed forward with their investigation, driven by their shared commitment to uncovering the truth about Diana's death. They knew that they were potentially putting themselves at risk by pursuing such sensitive information, but they also understood that Diana's letter represented a unique opportunity to expose a conspiracy that had remained hidden for more than 2 decades. As they gathered more evidence, Charles began to consider how he might use the information they had uncovered. Simply releasing Diana's letter to the public would create chaos, but it might not be sufficient to ensure that justice was served. The individuals responsible for the conspiracy were still alive, still powerful, and still capable of covering their tracks if given sufficient warning. The team realized that they needed to be strategic about how they revealed their findings. A coordinated release of information to multiple sources simultaneously might prevent the conspiracy from being suppressed again, but it would also create a media firestorm that could destroy innocent people along with the guilty. The challenge was finding a way to expose the truth while minimizing collateral damage to the institutions and individuals who had not been complicit in Diana's destruction. Charles also had to consider the impact that revealing the conspiracy would have on William and Harry. His sons deserved to know the truth about their mother's death, but they also deserved to be protected from the trauma of learning about the sophisticated campaign that had been waged against her. The knowledge that their mother had died not in a simple accident, but as the victim of an elaborate conspiracy, would fundamentally change how they viewed their own lives and their relationship with the institution they had been born to serve. Armed with irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy against Diana, Charles made the most difficult decision of his reign. He would confront the surviving architects of the plot directly, giving them an opportunity to confess their roles and face justice voluntarily before he exposed their crimes to the world. It was a dangerous gamble, but Charles felt he owed Diana the chance to see her tormentors held accountable for their actions. The first confrontation took place in the oak-paneled study at Buckingham Palace, where Charles summoned Lord Pemberton, his former private secretary who had been identified in Diana's letter as a key figure in the surveillance operation. Pemberton arrived expecting a routine briefing about royal duties, but instead found himself facing the cold fury of a monarch who had discovered the depth of his betrayal. Charles laid Diana's letter on the desk between them, watching as Pemberton's face went white with recognition. The older man's hands trembled slightly as he read passages that detailed his own meetings with intelligence operatives and his role in providing information about both Charles and Diana to their handlers. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the antique clock that had witnessed countless royal secrets over the decades. Pemberton finally looked up, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked how Charles had obtained the letter. The king's response was measured but filled with ice-cold anger as he explained about finding Diana's hidden cache of evidence. He detailed how the investigation had verified every claim Diana had made, how the conspiracy had been documented with photographic proof, and how the web of lies that had surrounded Diana's death was finally unraveling. The confrontation lasted for hours as Charles methodically went through each piece of evidence, forcing Pemberton to acknowledge his role in the systematic destruction of Diana's life. Pemberton initially attempted to justify his actions by claiming that Diana had posed a threat to national security through her humanitarian work, but Charles rejected these explanations with the contempt they deserved. As the conversation progressed, Pemberton began to reveal the full scope of the conspiracy that had engulfed Diana. He described a coordinated effort involving multiple government departments, intelligence services, and private contractors working together to neutralize what they perceived as a dangerous threat to established interests. Diana's growing international influence and her willingness to challenge powerful institutions had marked her for elimination. Pemberton revealed that the decision to target Diana had been made at the highest levels of government, with approval from officials who viewed her humanitarian work as naive interference in complex geopolitical situations. Her campaign against landmines, in particular, had been seen as a direct attack on British defense contractors and their government allies who profited from international conflicts. The psychological warfare campaign against Diana had been designed to isolate her from potential supporters and to undermine her credibility with the public. Every aspect of her personal life had been scrutinized and manipulated, from her relationships with men to her struggles with mental health. The goal had been to transform her from a beloved princess into a figure of ridicule and pity. Charles learned that even his own relationship with Camilla had been used as a weapon against Diana. Intelligence operatives had deliberately fed information to the press about Charles's ongoing relationship with Camilla, knowing that the resulting media coverage would further destabilize Diana's emotional state and damage her public image. The pain that both Charles and Diana had experienced during their divorce had been carefully orchestrated by professionals who viewed their suffering as acceptable collateral damage. Pemberton also revealed the existence of backup plans that had been developed in case the psychological warfare campaign failed to achieve its objectives. These plans had included options for more direct action against Diana, ranging from manufactured scandals that would force her into exile to more permanent solutions that would eliminate her influence entirely. The car crash in Paris had been the implementation of the most extreme option. The confession was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Michael Crawford, the former head of MI5 who had overseen the intelligence aspects of the operation against Diana. Crawford had been summoned by Charles using his royal prerogative to command the attendance of any British citizen, and he arrived at Buckingham Palace unaware that his decades-old secrets were about to be exposed. The confrontation with Crawford was even more intense than the session with Pemberton. As a professional intelligence officer, Crawford was more skilled at deflection and denial, but he was ultimately no match for the detailed evidence that Charles and his team had assembled. Diana's documentation included recordings of conversations that Crawford had believed were completely private, proving that Diana had been even more resourceful than her enemies had realized. Crawford initially attempted to invoke national security considerations to avoid discussing the operation against Diana, but Charles made it clear that such excuses would not be tolerated. As the reigning monarch, Charles had the authority to declassify any information he deemed necessary for the administration of justice, and he was prepared to use that authority without hesitation. Under relentless questioning, Crawford began to reveal the international dimensions of the conspiracy against Diana. The operation had involved cooperation with intelligence services from allied nations, all of whom had been concerned about Diana's growing influence over international humanitarian policy. Her ability to focus global attention on issues like landmines and refugee crises had been viewed as a threat to established diplomatic and commercial relationships. The conversation revealed that Diana's death had not been intended as the primary outcome of the operation against her. The original plan had been to force her into voluntary exile, where she could live quietly without interfering in international affairs. However, Diana's resourcefulness and determination had exceeded the expectations of her enemies, forcing them to escalate their tactics beyond their original intentions. Crawford admitted that the decision to eliminate Diana physically had been made when it became clear that she was preparing to expose the conspiracy against her. Intelligence services had discovered that Diana was planning to hold a press conference where she would reveal evidence of the surveillance and manipulation she had endured. The revelation would have exposed the entire operation and potentially brought down the government officials who had authorized it. The final confrontation was with Margaret Thornfield, a senior civil servant who had coordinated the government's response to Diana's humanitarian activities. Thornfield had been responsible for ensuring that Diana's work did not interfere with established policy objectives, and she had been instrumental in developing the strategies used to undermine Diana's effectiveness. Thornfield's confession revealed the bureaucratic machinery that had been used to destroy Diana's life. Government departments had worked together to create obstacles to Diana's charitable work, to limit her access to official information, and to ensure that her humanitarian efforts were consistently undermined by competing priorities and resource constraints. The goal had been to frustrate Diana into abandoning her activism voluntarily. The confrontations lasted for several days, with Charles methodically working through the list of conspirators that Diana had identified in her letter. Each session revealed new layers of the plot against her, painting a picture of an operation that had been far more extensive and sophisticated than even Diana had fully understood. The depth of the betrayal was staggering, involving trusted advisors, government officials, and intelligence operatives who had worked together to destroy an innocent woman whose only crime had been caring too deeply about the suffering of others. As the confessions mounted, Charles began to understand the full scope of the cover-up that had followed Diana's death. The same officials who had orchestrated her destruction had also controlled the investigation into her death, ensuring that the truth would remain hidden. Evidence had been suppressed, witnesses had been silenced, and the official narrative had been carefully crafted to hide the conspiracy behind a facade of tragic accident. The psychological toll of the confrontations was enormous for Charles, who was forced to relive Diana's suffering while learning about the sophisticated cruelty that had been directed against her. Each revelation added new layers to his understanding of what Diana had endured, and each confession deepened his determination to ensure that justice would finally be served. By the end of the confrontation process, Charles had obtained detailed admissions of guilt from all the surviving architects of the conspiracy against Diana. The evidence was now overwhelming and undeniable, supported by both Diana's original documentation and the confessions of those who had implemented the operation against her. The question that remained was how Charles would use this information to honor Diana's memory while protecting the institution of the monarchy from the chaos that would inevitably follow the revelations. Charles spent sleepless nights wrestling with the weight of Diana's revelations and the confessions he had extracted from her tormentors. The evidence before him was overwhelming, the guilt of the conspirators undeniable, and yet the implications of exposing the truth publicly were staggering. The monarchy, the government, and Britain's intelligence services would all be irreparably damaged by revelations that reached to the very heart of the establishment. The king found himself caught between his duty to seek justice for Diana and his responsibility to preserve the constitutional monarchy that had been entrusted to his care. Diana's letter had given him the power to destroy those who had destroyed her, but using that power would inevitably destroy much more than just the guilty parties. The collateral damage would be enormous, affecting innocent people and institutions that had no connection to the conspiracy against his former wife. As Charles contemplated his options, he was forced to confront the fundamental question that Diana's letter posed about the nature of power and justice in modern Britain. If the monarchy could not protect its own members from the machinations of unscrupulous officials, then what value did the institution really have? And if justice could only be achieved by destroying the very system that was supposed to provide it, then what kind of victory would that represent? The decision became even more complex when Charles considered the impact that exposing the conspiracy would have on William and Harry. His sons deserved to know the truth about their mother's death, but they also deserved to inherit a monarchy that retained some measure of moral authority and public respect. The revelation that their mother had been murdered by agents of the British state would traumatize them personally while potentially making their future roles as senior royals untenable. Charles also had to consider the international implications of exposing Diana's murder. The conspiracy had involved cooperation between British intelligence services and their counterparts in allied nations, all of whom had viewed Diana as a threat to established geopolitical relationships. Revealing the truth about Diana's death would damage Britain's relationships with key allies and potentially compromise ongoing intelligence operations that served legitimate national security purposes. After weeks of agonizing deliberation, Charles made a decision that honored both Diana's memory and his duty to the crown. Rather than expose the conspiracy publicly, he would use the evidence Diana had provided to secure justice through other means. The guilty parties would face consequences for their actions, but those consequences would be administered quietly, away from public scrutiny that could destabilize the institutions they had betrayed. Working with Sir David Manning and Dr. Four Field, Sarah Collins, Charles developed a comprehensive plan for holding the conspirators accountable while protecting the broader public interest. The plan involved a combination of legal action, financial restitution, and career destruction that would ensure that those responsible for Diana's death paid a heavy price for their crimes, even if that price was not extracted publicly. Lord Pemberton, Charles's former private secretary, was the first to face the consequences of his betrayal. Charles used his influence to ensure that Pemberton was stripped of all honors, expelled from his gentlemen's clubs, and ostracized from the social circles that had given his life meaning. More importantly, Charles arranged for Pemberton to face financial ruin through civil lawsuits that, while not explicitly mentioning the conspiracy against Diana, nevertheless held him accountable for breaches of fiduciary duty during his service to the crown. Sir Michael Crawford, the former MI5 director, found his pension revoked and his security clearance permanently withdrawn through administrative actions that appeared routine but effectively ended any possibility of his continuing to profit from his government service. Charles also ensured that Crawford's consulting contracts with private security firms were terminated, leaving the former spymaster financially vulnerable and professionally isolated. Margaret Thornfield, the civil servant who had coordinated the government's campaign against Diana, was forced into early retirement under circumstances that destroyed her reputation within Whitehall. Charles arranged for her to be assigned to meaningless positions until she was compelled to resign, her career trajectory permanently derailed by what appeared to be administrative incompetence. but was actually carefully orchestrated professional destruction. The financial aspects of Charles's justice campaign were particularly sophisticated. Using his access to royal finances and his influence over charitable foundations, Charles was able to redirect millions of pounds away from organizations that had benefited from the conspiracy against Diana toward causes that honored her memory. The arms dealers and defense contractors who had profited from Diana's elimination found their government contracts mysteriously terminated or transferred to competitors. Charles also used Diana's evidence to institute reforms within the royal household and intelligence services that would prevent similar conspiracies in the future. New oversight mechanisms were established, reporting requirements were strengthened, and personnel with connections to the anti-Diana operation were quietly transferred to positions where they could do no further damage. The changes appeared to be routine modernization efforts, but they were actually designed to dismantle the networks that had made Diana's destruction possible. The most significant aspect of Charles's response was his decision to honor Diana's humanitarian legacy by dramatically expanding the royal family's involvement in the causes she had championed. The anti-landmine campaign that had marked Diana for elimination became a central focus of royal charitable work, with William and Harry taking leading roles in continuing their mother's mission. The conspiracy that had sought to silence Diana's voice had ultimately amplified it beyond what it had achieved during her lifetime. Charles also ensured that Diana's sons learned the truth about their mother's death, but in a carefully controlled manner that emphasized their power to honor her memory, rather than their helplessness to change what had happened. William and Harry were devastated by the revelations, but they channeled their grief and anger into renewed commitment to the humanitarian work that had made their mother a target for elimination. The psychological impact of learning the truth about Diana's death was profound for both of her sons, but it also strengthened their resolve to use their positions as senior royals to protect others from similar persecution. They understood that their mother had died because she had cared too much about the suffering of others, and they were determined to ensure that her compassion would continue to challenge the powerful interests that preferred to operate in darkness. Charles's approach to justice also included efforts to support other individuals who had been targeted by similar operations. Using the intelligence that Diana had gathered and the confessions he had extracted, Charles was able to identify other public figures who had been subjected to surveillance and manipulation by the same networks that had destroyed Diana. Where possible, he provided them with warnings and assistance, helping them to protect themselves from ongoing threats. The international dimensions of the conspiracy against Diana were addressed through diplomatic channels that avoided public scandal, while still holding foreign intelligence services accountable for their roles in her death. Charles used Britain's intelligence relationships to extract commitments that similar operations would not be conducted against British citizens in the future. Leveraging the evidence Diana had provided to negotiate from a position of strength. As the months passed, the effects of Charles's justice campaign became increasingly apparent to those within the establishment who understood what was happening. The careers of the conspirators against Diana were systematically destroyed, their influence eliminated, and their ability to profit from their crimes permanently curtailed. The message was clear to anyone capable of recognizing it. The crown would protect its own, and betrayal would be met with consequences that extended far beyond official punishment. Charles found a measure of peace in implementing Diana's final wish for justice, even though that justice took a form that she might not have anticipated. The conspiracy against her had been exposed and defeated, the conspirators had been punished, and her humanitarian legacy had been secured for future generations. Most importantly, the institutional reforms that Charles had implemented would help ensure that no future member of the royal family would face the kind of systematic persecution that had ultimately claimed Diana's life. The letter that Diana had hidden in her jewelry box had given Charles the power to destroy her enemies and honor her memory, and he had used that power with the same careful calculation that had characterized his approach to every aspect of his royal duties. Diana's final message had not just revealed the truth about her death. It had provided the roadmap for ensuring that her life's work would continue long after those who had sought to silence her were forgotten. In the end, Charles's response to Diana's letter represented a form of justice that was perhaps more devastating to her enemies than public exposure would have been. The conspirators against Diana were destroyed quietly and thoroughly, their reputations ruined and their influence eliminated. without the martyrdom that a public trial might have provided. Diana's voice had ultimately proven more powerful than the forces that had sought to silence it, and her final message had ensured that justice would be served, even if it took a form that only those who truly understood power would recognize.